Okay, so this is Friday's lecture, um, so this is to substitute for Friday, February 17th's class, but this is covering the material that we would cover in class. You can obviously start and stop it if you need to go back and take notes on something, and we can try to review some of this next week as well. But where we left off on Wednesday was talking about the Maya writing system, and we looked at the calendar, and hopefully you guys have had a chance to try and decipher that Maya date. But the Maya put their dates on many of their monuments, right? So the Mayan writing system is closely connected to uh, dates and the use of the calendar. Right, so like we talked about before, on a lot of these Maya stela, these were profiled in the movie. You have birth dates of king, and you have the dates when they became king, the ascension dates. You have dates on when ceremonies took place. You have dates on monuments that commemorate the capture of an enemy king. Right, and so Maya glyphs and Maya writing is closely connected also with their calendar. Okay, so let's take a look at another civilization, China. Right, so the earliest Chinese writing that can be read dates to around 1500 or slightly earlier. It looks like it was developing earlier than that, but that's when the uh, the pictograms can actually be read. Uh, they probably wrote on a variety of materials like silk and bamboo and things like that, but those haven't preserved. So the only thing that archaeologists have left to study the earliest Chinese writing are these bones, right? And these are referred to as oracle bones. They were used by ancient Chinese kings to foretell the future, right? They're also called it's the practice of using these oracle bones is also called scapulomancy, right? So like necromancy is using magic, scapulomancy is using scapula bones in order to foretell the future, right? So there was a real close connection, as you're going to see, between religion and writing. Writing essentially was a way of foretelling or being able to foretell the future. So how would this work? Right? Well, you could see some of the Chinese characters over here. The earliest Chinese writing is almost completely logographic, right? That is, each symbol represents a word, an action, right? It represents not a syllable. So in the beginning, the symbols were not used to spell out words. Each symbol represented an idea, a word, an object, etc. Okay, so how would the kings foretell the future? Well, it's interesting that the kings themselves would practice this. So Chinese kings knew how to read and write. And what they would do is they would write a question on a bone, an animal bone, like a tortoise shell or a scapula bone. Then they would heat up a bronze needle and they would poke the needle on the back of the bone and cracks would form. They would interpret the cracks and basically interpret it to answer their question that they were asking of the ancestors. And then later on, after the event occurred, they would then write on the bone what actually happened. Right? So when we look at Chinese civilization in a couple of weeks, we're going to look at some of these oracle bones and the translation of some of these oracle bones. But it could be something like the king asking his ancestors, should we go to war against these people? And then interpreting the cracks. It's usually not a yes or no answer, and it's usually something like, well, if this happens, it's good. If this happens, then it's not so good. So it's sort of like an ambiguous interpretation, right? But you could see a lot of the early Chinese characters here, and then what they look like later on in time, right? So you can see very pictographic. Each character kind of looks like what it's supposed to represent. So sun for day, right? You can see rain here. not rain, right? So the character for rain, but then also a symbol that means not with it. Let's take a look at some other examples. You can see here, again, very logographic, pictographic, and you could see that through time. So the earliest is the Shang period, that's about 1800, 1500. You can see through time up to modern Chinese, the characters become more abstract and more simplified over time, right? So here's a horse. Ma is Chinese for horse, and you can see it becoming more and more abstract. A lot of other characters, again, similar thing. So a woman, an ear, a horse, like we said, a fish, mountains, the sun, and the moon, right? So it was a simple language to start with, and then it became more and more complicated, right? But writing in Chinese civilization has always kept a sacred aspect to it, right? That is, writing is very important. It's considered sacred, probably because it was a way that the kings could actually communicate with their ancestors and receive divine help to understand problems, right? So there's something sacred about Chinese writing that maybe didn't exist in other writing systems. Okay. Um, Modern Chinese became more complicated, right? So in modern Chinese, you don't just have the characters that represent certain things. You also, some of these characters have a phonetic character next to them that tells you how to pronounce that character, and that actually changes the meaning, right? So you could kind of see here that there's similar syllables, right? You can see it looks like similar sounds, but they're actually pronounced slightly differently, and that changes the meaning. So we looked at horse. Horse is ma, right? You could pronounce it differently, like ma, and that means to scold. Ma, which is mother, right? So what we would consider the same syllable is not actually the same syllable. Slight pronunciation, different emphasis on one of the syllables changes the meaning. So modern Chinese, you can see, is more complicated, but it still has that pictographic, logographic quality to it, right? So in modern Chinese, there's still hundreds of different characters for people to learn. So it never became an alphabetic system. Okay, there's also writing that archaeologists have questions whether it actually was writing or not. And then there's also writing that has never been deciphered, right? So up here, this is a piece of stone from the Indus Valley, from the area of India and Pakistan, and it shows a water buffalo, and it has these characters up there, which most archaeologists think is the ancient writing system of the people of the Indus. And this is the clay impression from that seal. Right? So far, archaeologists and linguists have been unable to translate Harappan or the Indus script, right? It's undeciphered. There's no Rosetta Stone. There's nothing we could compare it to. We don't know what the characters represent or mean. So all of these texts have never been translated. We don't know exactly what they're saying, right? But you have a lot of different forms of writing, especially seals, in this Indus civilization, right? So here you can see, again, another piece of stone with an animal, and then these characters, right? And you can see, again, some other examples. Usually these texts are short, and we don't know exactly what they're saying, so archaeologists have not been able to translate them. But they're trying to begin the decipherment of Indus by using computers, right? So they're trying to look at different characters and see the frequency of their appearance with other characters and see if they can actually use that information to crack the code. But so far they've been unable to. Okay. Then there's also an accounting system and you read a little bit about this from that New York Times article, called Kipu, right? And Kipu is probably not a full-fledged writing system. It's more of an accounting system, we think, right? And so the Inca Empire, and here you can see Machu Picchu, one of the most famous sites of the Inca. The Inca were an empire in South America, and we're going to learn about them in a few weeks as well, right? But the Inca were a very large society, right? An empire the size of the Roman Empire, and they didn't have a writing system, it looks like. What they had was an accounting system. So what quipu are knots on strings that are then tied to longer pieces of rope. And the different kinds of knots represent different things and represent amounts of things. That's what we think. As they find more and more of these, archaeologists are getting a better understanding of maybe how the system worked, right? But here you can see another example. You can see a quipu from South America in the Field Museum in their exhibit on ancient America, which is pretty interesting. But you can see all the different strings here of different colors, right? It looks like these were used to keep records, like the system of the tokens in the bulla in Mesopotamia. They're used to keep track of things, records. They're usually kept and sort of folded and neatly stored in these administrative centers or storehouses in the Inca Empire, right? But you could tie a string to form different kinds of knots, right? If you are tying like a simple overhand knot, but you keep wrapping one end around that loop and then pull, you might get something that looks almost like a hangman's knot or something like that. So you can tie the string in different ways, and the different knots represent different amounts and different things, right? Okay, so in general, what do we see about writing, right? Well, in general, what we see is that writing was invented independently in different parts of the world. Right? So yes, there was some influence in many areas, like we said with the alphabet, influencing the development of the Greek alphabet and the Latin alphabet. But in many areas of the world, Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Maya, the Indus, China, they developed writing systems all on their own. Right? Writing is usually associated with complex societies, mostly states. But as we saw with the Inca, not all states had a writing system. Right? So writing is usually found in states, but not every state actually had a writing system. Writing, it looks like, was invented in different parts of the world for different reasons. So in Mesopotamia, it looks like the reasons for the development of writing, the thing that was pushing the invention of writing, was economic uses. In Egypt, it looks like it was more political uses, recording of property and ownership and political history. With the Maya, it looks like their their writing system was connected closely to the calendar. It's a little bit hard to figure out what the incentive to develop it was, but it looks like recording history, religion, connection to the calendar. And in China, at least from what we can tell, the earliest Chinese writing was used mainly for what we would call divination, foretelling the future, oracles, right? And that was scapulomancy. The alphabet was invented, looks like, by the Phoenicians, the Canaanites in the Middle East, who kind of adopted some of the hieroglyphs, invented their own characters, and used them to represent the smallest units of sound, right? Not syllabic, but actually representing smaller units than syllables, right? And some writing, as we said, has not been deciphered. So the Harappan civilization, also called the Indus civilization, had a writing system, but so far we've been unable to decipher it. And you have complex states and empires that also didn't have writing, like we said. Right? Okay, so that covers writing, and this is the material that you'll need for the next quiz, which will be Friday the 24th, Next Friday, right, we'll have a quiz on, I'll put a study guide on Blackboard. It'll be on agriculture in the Americas, political organizations of bands, tribes, chiefdom states, theories on the origins of states or explaining the origins of states, and writing systems. Right? Our topic for next week, which will not be on this quiz, we're just going to cover a little bit now, right? And this is our next topic is the origin of the first civilization in Mesopotamia, right? Specifically, southern Mesopotamia here. So this is the area today of Iraq, right? So here you can see the Euphrates, and here's the Tigris, right? And the very first civilization in the world and the earliest cities arose here in southern Mesopotamia about 5,000 years ago, roughly 5,000 years ago. Right, so we'll just kind of start the topic, and this is something we'll continue next week. Okay, but one of the important things to understand about Mesopotamia is that the environment that they were living in set up opportunities, but it also set up constraints. And it looks like it was a combination of benefits that they had from living in that area, but also things that they were lacking that kind of created this dynamic that pushed them forward to develop into a more complex society. Right? So if you go really far south in Iraq, there are marshes there. They're coming back. Unfortunately, these marshes, many of them were destroyed by Saddam Hussein, who diverted the river away from the marsh areas and dried them out. He's trying to punish the Shiite population there. Now the marshes are beginning to come back. There's an amazing diversity of resources in these marshes, right? Fish, waterfowl, reeds, all sorts of things. Just north of the marshes was land that was extremely fertile. Right? Now, one of the things you have to understand about southern Mesopotamia is there's almost no rainfall here. Right? Up here, there is rainfall. Right? So here, they could practice agriculture, just basically using the yearly rain cycle. But in southern Mesopotamia, they had to irrigate. Without irrigation, they couldn't practice agriculture. Right? The flip side of that, though, is that if they irrigated, this specific area is one of the most fertile areas of the Middle East. So that was one of their advantages. They had very fertile land, which means that they could grow more crops than almost anywhere else in this region, which means they could produce surplus, which means that they could support a larger population, which means there was a larger labor force, right? Which also meant that there could be more wealth differences, which means that people could be freed up for craft specialization, right? And so this was one of the big advantages that Mesopotamia had. The other advantage that they had was the rivers. The rivers are not only important for irrigation, but they're also important for transportation. Right? Water transport still today is the most efficient way to transport anything. As long as you could put something on a boat and sail that boat somewhere, upstream, downstream, using oars or wind or what have you, it is extremely efficient. Right? Just to give you an example, I was mailing a package to Australia, and the post office said that this small package weighed about a pound, would cost $60 to get to Australia. Right? Then I said, well, how about another option? And they said, okay, well, the other option is $6. I was like, okay, that sounds good. They said, yeah, but it's going to take 6 weeks to get there, which was fine. But what that shows is, yeah, you could mail something airmail. It will get there in a few days, but it's very costly versus ship. Extremely efficient and much, much cheaper. So, still today, 85% of our goods that come from different countries come by boat. Right here you can see Mesopotamia, Iraq, in the late 19th century, early 20th century, and you see this boat here filled with melons, right? You can see again, a very efficient way to go. If you don't use, and the great thing about Mesopotamia was they had these canals and they had rivers and they had marshes, so they could move everything around this area of southern Mesopotamia. If you don't use boats, you got to use land transportation, which in ancient times is very limited, right? Donkeys can only carry a certain amount. You're very limited in terms of what you can do. So those were some of the advantages that southern Mesopotamia had, right? So again, this area was very, very fertile if they irrigated. So the earliest complex society, the earliest farmers in southern Mesopotamia were a group of people called the Obeid. It's called the Obeid Period, the Obeid culture, right? And the only reason why it's called that is because they found this time period at a site called Obeid, so they called the whole culture in the whole time period Obeid, right? But the advantages in Mesopotamia, again, were, transportation and irrigated land that was very, very fertile. The disadvantages, you could kind of see a little bit here, and you can also see here. Mesopotamia, southern Mesopotamia, lacked stone, no trees, right? No metals. Right? Those are things that they grew to need more and more as they were living there. So that was sort of a necessity. They had advantages, but they lacked certain things. The necessity forced them to trade for these things. And in order to trade, you have to produce something to trade for the things you want. So it was that kind of need that kind of pushed their civilization along. So it's a combination of advantages and disadvantages that kind of led to the development of Mesopotamian civilization. So this is the time when they first settled in southern Mesopotamia, and we're going to look at that period. And then this is the time period where they develop into a civilization. Right? Okay, so let's stop here. This is where the video will end, and this is where we'll pick up on Monday.